In the early 1800s, a network of secret routes and safe houses evolved to help slaves escape to free states and to Canada, where slavery was prohibited. This network was not run by a single organization, but by many individuals sympathetic to the cause, predominantly free northern blacks, but many whites as well. The pathway to freedom was once described as a vast network of paths and roads through swamps and over mountains, along and across rivers and even by sea, which cannot be documented with precision. Because of the need for secrecy, very few written records were made. Certain local citizens and organizations were known to be available to aid fugitives, but there was no overall structure. Despite its loosely defined organization, the process effectively moved hundreds of slaves northward each year. According to one estimate, the South lost 100,000 slaves between 1810 and 1850. The journey of escape was difficult and dangerous, not only because of the often treacherous terrain, but because aiding a fugitive slave violated federal law, punishable by sizable fines and even jail. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 allowed slave hunters to seize alleged fugitive slaves without due process of law and prohibited anyone from aiding escaped fugitives or obstructing their recovery. The escape system became known as the Underground Railroad, since it was at this time that the steam railroad system was developing. Fugitive slaves entered Connecticut at many different locations as a number of so-called stations in several towns became available. Farmington was considered the Grand Central Station in Connecticut since it had several safe houses. An important and active Connecticut station was this house in Wintonbury, now the town of Bloomfield. Francis Gillette built this home that he called Wildwood in 1833. Born in 1807, Gillette was a man of strong convictions. He was active in the temperance movement, and along with several other reformers, he founded the American Temperance Insurance Company that sold policies only to teetotalers. But the business was only moderately successful, and 10 years later it became the Phoenix Mutual Life Insurance Company, selling to all without regard to personal temperance. Gillette was elected to the Connecticut Assembly in 1832 and again in 1838, and later in 1854 was appointed to the United States Senate on the Free Soil Party ticket to fill out the term of Truman Smith, who retired. With a strong interest in improving public education, Gillette was instrumental in founding the New Britain Normal School for the training of teachers, and he served as its chairman from 1849 until 1865. This institution has evolved into Central Connecticut State University. He was also credited with having built a new brick school to replace the ancient wooden one on what is now Cottage Grove Road in Bloomfield, not far from his home. Over the door were inscribed the words, "Receive instruction and not silver, knowledge rather than gold." When the Wintonbury Parish, part of Windsor, was incorporated as a new town in 1835, Gillette is said to have gazed out at the wildflowers in his meadows and suggested that the town be named Bloomfield. But Gillette's most ardent interest was the abolition of slavery. His views were no doubt further strengthened after he married Eliza Daggett Hooker, a direct descendant of Thomas Hooker, the founder of Hartford. Her brother, John Hooker, was a leading abolitionist who married Isabella Beecher, whose siblings were Henry Ward Beecher, the noted preacher and social reformer, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. When she met President Lincoln in 1862, the president is alleged to have said, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Propelled by his strong religious beliefs, Gillette devoted his greatest energies to the abolition of slavery and was frustrated by the indifference of most citizens, especially ministers and churches. In a speech he gave over and over, he said, "What is American slavery? It is the changing of a man into a thing, a commodity, an article of property, a chattel. It is converting man, intellectual and immortal, made in the divine image and ransomed by divine blood, into merchandise, to rank in the creation with cattle and horses and swine." As a member of the state legislature in 1838, he condemned Connecticut's Canterbury Law, or Black Law, forbidding the education of blacks from out of state, a law that was passed after Prudence Crandall opened a school for Negro girls in Canterbury, Connecticut. At the same session, he advocated, unsuccessfully, that the state's black residents be given the vote. Fugitive slaves enjoyed his hospitality, and he enjoyed listening to their stories and songs as they sat by his fire. It is said that runaways stayed in his house as well as in the large barn to the rear of the house. They traveled on to other safe houses on the road farther north without knowing they had enjoyed the hospitality of a United States senator. And apparently, he continued to receive runaways even after he moved to his new house at Nook Farm in Hartford, the area he developed with his brother-in-law, John Hooker. His Nook Farm neighbors would come to include Charles Dudley Warner, essayist and editor of the Hartford Courant, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain. This Greek Revival-style house is one of several in Bloomfield and surrounding towns made of trap rock constructed during the 1830 to 1835 time period. Mr. Gillette's house, on what is now Bloomfield Avenue, was completed a year before his marriage in 1834 to Eliza. In a letter, he said that the stone was obtained from the mountain directly west, which was Talcott Mountain. Gillette had strong connections with other original owners of Wintonberry's trap rock houses, especially Oliver Philly and David Grant. All were involved in farming and were in the top 8% in the wealth category in the mid-1800s. After Gillette moved to Nook Farm, Wildwood was sold to Palmer Southworth in 1852. A partial list of successive owners, many who ran dairy farms here, has been compiled. In 1918, Eva Sykes Lake sold the property to A. Raleigh Carpenter, who, like previous owners, ran a dairy business, his known as Wildwood Farm Dairy. In 1953, his widow, Mattie Bacon Carpenter, sold the house to Connecticut General Life Insurance Company, but she continued to live there until her death in 1971 at age 93. The house remained unoccupied and boarded up after Mrs. Carpenter's death, as discussion about its fate went on for years between Connecticut General, the town of Bloomfield, and the Winterberry Historical Society. The dialogue included the question of restoration versus preservation versus demolition. What could the eventual use of the house be if saved? A conference center? A museum? A library and office of the Historical Society? In 1982, after the company had become Cigna, it was decided to develop the large property that was associated with Wildwood, but the house would be moved. Cigna opted to preserve it and wanted to make sure that it served an ongoing social purpose. In the final determination, it was decided that the building would become a group home for the program participants of Oak Hill, a nonprofit institution for people with disabilities founded in 1893 as the Connecticut Institute for the Blind. Oak Hill was already renting a house on the Cigna campus that was slated to be demolished. The house, minus its porches, was hoisted from its foundation onto 140 tons of steel beams. On a May 1990 morning, mounted on 16 sets of dollies and pulled by 2 truck-mounted winches and held back by another, it started a 5-day trip, traveling half-mile north and closer to Bloomfield Avenue, where it was lowered onto a new foundation. Cigna assumed the entire bill of the move and the preservation. The house was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1982. According to the Connecticut Historical Commission, its designation was based on its significance as an affluent home of the period and the importance of its original owner. Before it was moved, the National Park Service took pictures of the interior of the house. And after the relocation of the structure, and before Oak Hill moved in, these additional pictures were taken. The house has been modified many times since the original Gillette ownership. Currently, the house is a comfortable, gracious home for Oak Hill program participants with 24-hour staffing. It is a perfect use for a house that aided so many in the past. Francis Gillette died in 1879 and was buried in his family plot in Farmington. One of his sons, William, became a noted playwright and actor, famous for his portrayal of Sherlock Holmes. Francis had a life full of accomplishments. His intense interest in education resulted in lasting public institutions. He was a founding member of the Republican Party in Connecticut, formed in 1854 to combat the Kansas-Nebraska Act that threatened to extend slavery into the territories. A man of intense convictions and compassion, he was one of the most eloquent speakers of his time. He was an outstanding figure in the anti-slavery movement in Connecticut and was able to communicate to our citizens the essential connection between abolitionism as a humanitarian reform and as a political action necessary to the cohesive development of the United States. His fundamental convictions are summed up when, in 1854, he said, "All men, irrespective of color, stature, height, circumference, or any other of the accidents of being, should have the same rights and the enjoyment of the same privileges to work out the great problem of their existence and to participate equally." Francis Gillette's house in Bloomfield remains an important historic artifact from the turbulent times leading up to the Civil War.